Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 years ago, a small group of human beings stood at the edge of a continent and looked across water. We do not know how many of them there were. The genetic evidence, read backward through the centuries like a sentence slowly reconstructing itself from scattered letters, suggests the number was small, shockingly, almost absurdly small. Perhaps a few hundred individuals, perhaps fewer. Some models suggest a founding population so narrow that all of the roughly 8 billion people alive on Earth today, every person who has ever walked a street in Seoul, or Lagos, or Lima, or Oslo, carries in their cells the genetic legacy of what was, by any ecological standard, a tiny and precarious band of travelers who made a crossing that should not have worked. The water in front of them was the southern end of the Red Sea, a passage of salt and wind and current perhaps 30 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. And on the other side was a world that no anatomically modern human had ever entered. The world, in other words, that became ours. Tonight we are going to follow them. We are going to trace the most consequential journey in the history of our species. The journey that carried human beings out of the continent where they were born, across deserts and mountains and seas that had never known a human footstep, and eventually to every habitable corner of the earth. This is not a simple story of migration in the way we use that word today. People moving between countries with maps and provisions, and some knowledge of where they are going. This was something else entirely. This was dispersal in the deep biological sense, the spreading of a species into new range, driven by population pressure and ecological opportunity, and perhaps by something harder to name, a restlessness, a horizon-seeking quality that was already becoming one of the most distinctive features of the human mind. The journey took tens of thousands of years. It carried our ancestors across burning deserts and through mountain passes choked with snow, and along coastlines that no longer exist because the sea has since risen and swallowed them. And it left a record in rock and in bone, and, most astonishingly of all, in the living cells of every human being alive today. A record we are only now learning to read with anything like precision. So before we begin that journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if this kind of deep, slow exploration is genuinely what you are looking for. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Knowing that these stories travel that far, to wherever you are in the dark, is something I find I never quite get used to. Now, find your comfortable position. Let the room settle around you, and let us go back, very far back, to a world that was both utterly different from our own, and in the ways that mattered most, exactly the same. Africa, 70,000 years ago. Before we can understand the crossing, we need to understand the world that produced the people who made it, and the specific set of circumstances that pushed a small group of them toward a shore they had never seen before, looking out at water they had never crossed, in the direction of a land they could not have known was there. The African continent in the late Pleistocene was not a single environment any more than it is today. It was a mosaic, always shifting, responding to the great oscillations of the ice ages that were, even then, in their most recent chapter. The Pleistocene, the geological epoch that began roughly 2.6 million years ago, and ended only 11,700 years ago, with the onset of our current warmer interglacial period, was a time of extraordinary climatic instability. The ice sheets that covered vast swaths of northern Eurasia and North America grew and contracted on cycles of roughly 100,000 years, driven by subtle variations in the Earth's orbit and axial tilt. The so-called Milankovitch cycles, first described mathematically by the Serbian astronomer Milutin Milankovic in the early 20th century. When the ice sheets grew, they sequestered enormous quantities of water, lowering global sea levels by as much as 120 to 130 meters below their current position. When they retreated, the meltwater returned to the oceans, the sea levels rose, and the coastlines of the world shifted dramatically. In Africa, these global ice age cycles translated into periods of increased aridity and periods of increased rainfall, what paleoecologists call wet and dry phases, or pluvials and interpluvials. During dry phases, the Sahara Desert expanded dramatically southward, potentially cutting off the populations of human beings in sub-Saharan Africa from those in northern Africa and the Levant for thousands of years at a stretch. During wet phases, the Sahara contracted. Ancient river systems flowed through what is now empty desert. Lakes appeared in basins that today are dust, and corridors of habitable terrain opened that allowed human and animal populations to move freely between regions that had been isolated from each other for millennia. The timing of these wet and dry cycles in Africa is one of the critical puzzles that researchers studying the out-of-Africa migration are still working to solve, because the question of when people could have crossed the Sahara or traversed the Horn of Africa into Arabia is inseparable from the question of what the climate was doing at the time. The people who made the crossing were, by the time they reached the edge of the continent, already anatomically modern. The species Homo sapiens, the wise human, had been in existence for at least 300,000 years by this point, and perhaps longer. The oldest currently known fossil specimens of anatomically modern humans come from the Jebel Irhoud site in Morocco, dated to approximately 315,000 years ago, and described in a landmark paper in Nature in 2017 by Jean-Jacques Hublin and his colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. These specimens have a face that would look familiar to a modern observer, though the brain case is still somewhat lower and more elongated than the high, rounded skull of fully modern humans. By around 200,000 years ago, the Homo kibish specimens from Ethiopia, and a little later, the Herto specimens from the Middle Awash region of the Afar Depression, show a skull shape essentially indistinguishable from any living person. 300,000 years. That is how long our species had existed on this planet before the group we are following tonight made the crossing. It is a span of time that makes the entirety of recorded human history, from the first writing to the last thing published this morning, look like a footnote. It is 15 times the length of all of civilization as we commonly define it, and for most of those 300,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived entirely in Africa. They did not leave. Or if some small groups left, they left no detectable genetic trace in the populations that would eventually spread across the rest of the world. The Africa that produced our species was also, for an extraordinarily long time, the entirety of the world that our species knew. Why so long? Why did it take 300,000 years for a cognitively modern, socially complex, technologically equipped species to begin moving beyond the continent of its birth? The question sounds simple, but the answer, or rather the cluster of competing possible answers, reveals something important about the relationship between human beings and the environments they inhabit. To understand the out-of-Africa dispersal fully, we need to spend more time inside Africa before the crossing happens. Because the Africa that produced the emigrants was not a single unified population moving in the same direction. It was a continent of remarkable geographic and ecological diversity that had been producing human genetic and cultural diversity for hundreds of thousands of years before the dispersal. The story of what happened inside Africa during those deep centuries is not merely background. It is the substance, the raw material, from which the dispersal was made possible. Southern Africa holds some of the most important evidence. The sites strung along the western and southern Cape Coast of what is now South Africa, from Pinnacle Point near Mossel Bay, to Blombos Cave near Stilbaai, to Sibidu Cove in KwaZulu-Natal, have produced an archaeological record of increasing richness and sophistication across the period from roughly 160,000 to 60,000 years ago. At Pinnacle Point, a site excavated extensively by Curtis Marion and his team, there is evidence for the exploitation of marine shellfish as a regular, organized dietary resource dated to 164,000 years ago. during a period of extreme aridity when many of the interior parts of the continent were essentially uninhabitable and coastal refugia may have been the last productive environments available to human populations. The fact that the people at Pinnacle Point were eating shellfish is not in itself remarkable. The remarkable thing is that they were doing it systematically, as a reliable dietary strategy rather than opportunistically, and that they were doing it at a time when marine resources may have been the difference between survival and local extinction. The coast, in other words, saved us. It saved us during the worst of the Pleistocene aridity by providing a reliable food base when the interior was parched and empty, and it later provided the highway along which the dispersal moved. The relationship between our species and the sea is ancient and deep, far deeper than the seafaring traditions of the last few thousand years suggest. The ochre evidence from these sites deserves particular attention. Ochre, iron oxide in various mineral forms ranging from yellow limonite to red hematite, is found at South African archaeological sites in quantities and with processing signatures that go far beyond any purely utilitarian use. At Blombos Cave, ochre pieces have been found that were clearly used as crayons, worn flat on one surface through rubbing against another surface. Some of the ochre pieces bear engraved geometric patterns, cross-hatchings, and series of parallel lines that are clearly deliberate and clearly non-utilitarian. The abalone shell ochre processing kit from Blombos, with its ground ochre pigment and the mixing shell, and the associated tools for preparing and applying the pigment, tells us that people were producing pigment for use on surfaces or bodies in a planned, organized, multi-step process. This is not the behavior of an animal painting accidentally or instinctively. It is the behavior of a creature with a premeditated intention to apply a specific substance to achieve a specific visual effect in a shared symbolic context. The red color of ochre is significant. Red is the color of blood, of fire, of danger, and of vitality. In many human cultural traditions across the globe, red pigment is associated with life force, with ceremonial transformation, with the marking of significant transitions in individual or social life. Whether this association is deeply ancient, whether it predates the dispersal and was carried by the emigrants into the New World in some form, is impossible to know with certainty. But the ubiquity of ochre use across human cultures, its appearance at the earliest sites of modern behavioral complexity, and its continued presence in the symbolic traditions of some of the most ancient and least changed cultural traditions on Earth, including the Seine of southern Africa, suggests that it is not a coincidence. Ochre and what it means may be one of the oldest continuous threads in human cultural life, something that connects the people of Blombos Cave to a vast range of subsequent traditions in a genealogy of symbolic practice that stretches across the better part of our species' existence. The Middle Stone Age of southern Africa, the period from roughly 300,000 to roughly 25,000 years ago, is not a monolithic technological tradition. It contains multiple distinct industries, periods of technological elaboration separated by periods of relative simplicity, regional variations that reflect the geographic diversity of the environments in which people were living, and the social diversity of the populations that inhabited them. The Still Bay industry, defined by its distinctive bifacially worked silkreed points, appears at sites across the Southern Cape in a period centered around 75,000 years ago, and it is associated with the richest symbolic behavior in the pre-dispersal record, including the Blombos ochre engravings and shell beads. The Howison's port industry that followed it, around 65 to 60,000 years ago, shows even more sophisticated composite tool technology, with backed microliths that were almost certainly hafted in handles as parts of complex multi-component tools, and geographic evidence of long-distance exchange of materials across hundreds of kilometers. These are not the products of simple, opportunistic technology. They are the products of planning, of social networks, of a cognitive relationship to the material world that is in all relevant respects identical to our own. The population dynamics of late Pleistocene Africa are also increasingly accessible through the ancient DNA record, and what that record is revealing is that Africa during the period leading up to the dispersal was not a single interconnected population sharing the same genes and the same culture across the continent. It was a mosaic of partially isolated groups, separated by the same climatic barriers, expanding seas of desert and contracting areas of forest, that periodically isolated and reconnected populations across the continent. Each period of isolation allowed genetic and cultural divergence to accumulate. Each period of reconnection, when the climate shifted and corridors opened, allowed gene flow and cultural exchange to occur. The result, by the time of the dispersal, was a continent of remarkable genetic and cultural diversity, with some populations in southern Africa carrying deep lineages that had been diverging from the lineage that eventually produced the emigrants for hundreds of thousands of years. This internal African diversity is, in some respects, more ancient and more profound than the diversity between African and non-African populations today. The San of southern Africa are not, as a simplistic model might suggest, simply the most ancient representatives of a primordial African culture. They are the descendants of a specific lineage with its own long and complicated history, shaped by the same climatic oscillations and population dynamics that shaped every other African lineage. Their genetic distinctiveness from other African populations reflects hundreds of thousands of years of partial isolation in the southern part of the continent, interrupted by periods of gene flow. Their cultural traditions, their click languages, with their extraordinary phonemic inventories, their extensive knowledge of the Kalahari ecosystem, their rock art tradition of staggering richness and antiquity, are the products of a specific cultural history of enormous depth. They are not a window directly into the ancestral condition of all humans, but they are a window into one of the oldest and richest branches of the human family. A branch that was already ancient and elaborated long before the crossing was made. The genetics of the internal African diversity also tells us something important about the scale of the population that was present in Africa before the dispersal. The genetic signals of population bottlenecks and expansions read from the patterns of variation in modern African genomes and from the growing ancient DNA record, suggest that the total population of Homo sapiens in Africa during the late Pleistocene was not large. Estimates vary, but the pre-dispersal African population may have numbered in the tens of thousands across the entire continent, with substantial fluctuations driven by the climatic oscillations of the Pleistocene. At their low points, during the most severe arid phases, regional populations may have been reduced to small refugia, isolated clusters of people clinging to the most productive remaining habitats that genetic models suggest may have experienced near extinction level bottlenecks before the climate shifted again and allowed expansion. The species was fragile. It had been fragile multiple times. The dispersal did not emerge from a condition of demographic strength, but from a condition that was, by the standards of later human history, one of considerable demographic precariousness. A slightly worse climatic shift at the wrong moment. A slightly more severe drought in southern Africa at the wrong time. And the lineage that produced the emigrants might have gone extinct before the crossing was made. We are not just the descendants of people who were smart enough and equipped enough to make the journey. We are the descendants of people who were lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, in a world that could have gone very differently. The Toba supervolcanic eruption, which occurred approximately 74,000 years ago in what is now Sumatra, has been proposed by some researchers as one of those near-extinction moments. The Toba eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in the past 2 million years, producing a stratospheric aerosol loading that may have caused a global volcanic winter lasting years to decades, dramatically reducing solar radiation, collapsing plant communities, and potentially reducing human populations to a few thousand individuals. The genetic evidence for a severe bottleneck in the human lineage around this time has been cited as support for the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. Other researchers argue that the evidence for a Toba-driven bottleneck is not as robust as claimed, and that human populations in Africa and perhaps also in India survived the eruption with less catastrophic losses than the original hypothesis proposed. The debate is ongoing, but the eruption was real, and its environmental impact was substantial, and the people who were alive in Africa 74,000 years ago lived through a period of severe climatic disruption whose consequences for human population size and distribution we are still working to understand. What seems clear is that the people who eventually made the crossing did so from a population that had been through multiple severe bottlenecks, that had survived repeated near extinctions by virtue of the same combination of behavioral flexibility, social cooperation, and accumulated cultural knowledge that eventually carried their descendants to the furthest corners of the earth. Resilience was not a later addition to the human character. It was present at the very beginning, forged in the repeated crises of the late Pleistocene African climate, and it was the precondition for everything that followed. Part of the answer lies in ecology. Africa is a continent of extraordinary ecological richness and complexity, and the human populations of the late Pleistocene were, by every measure available to us from the archaeological record, deeply embedded in and adapted to the specific environments they occupied. They were not strangers to their landscapes. They were experts, with knowledge accumulated across generations about the seasonal movements of prey animals, the locations of water sources, the properties of local stones and plants, the patterns of rainfall and drought. Moving into an unknown landscape meant moving away from that accumulated knowledge, leaving behind the cognitive map that was, in a pre-literate world, one of the most important possessions any individual or group could have. It was not fear that kept humans in Africa for 300,000 years. It was the extraordinary depth of the relationship between these people and the specific piece of world they understood. But the record also suggests something else. The behavioral sophistication that we associate with the out of Africa dispersal, the cognitive modernity that appears to be a prerequisite for successful colonization of genuinely new and challenging environments, was not fully present throughout those 300,000 years. It appears to have been developing, deepening, becoming more elaborate and more flexible across the later Pleistocene, in ways that made the eventual dispersal possible in a way that an earlier attempt might not have been. The site of Blombos Cave, on the southern coast of South Africa, is one of the most important windows we have into the emergence of behavioral modernity in the African archaeological record. Blombos was excavated extensively by Christopher Hensherwood and his colleagues beginning in the 1990s, and what they found within its layers of ochre-stained sediment has repeatedly pushed back the dates at which we thought fully modern behavior appeared in our species. Red ochre pieces bearing geometric engravings dated to at least 77,000 years ago. Perforated Nassarius kraussianus shells, tiny snail shells with deliberately made holes that allowed them to be strung as beads, dated to around 75,000 years ago and representing some of the oldest personal ornaments in the human record. Bone tools of remarkable precision. A small abalone shell toolkit for mixing and storing ochre-based pigment, suggesting not just the use of pigment but the deliberate preparation and storage of a material, whose primary use appears to have been symbolic or social, rather than purely practical. These items tell us something specific and significant. The people at Blombos Cave were engaging in symbolic behavior, in the manipulation of arbitrary signs whose meaning is shared within a social community rather than inherent in the object itself. A red ochre bead on a string refers to something beyond itself. It signals group membership, status, alliance, identity. It is a symbol in the full cognitive sense, and symbols require, in their production and their reading, a cognitive architecture that is in certain key respects indistinguishable from the one that we use today. The people who made those beads were, in the ways that matter most for the story we are telling tonight, people like us. The evidence from Blombos and from other southern African sites like Pinnacle Point, Sibidu Cave, and Dikelders suggests that the package of behaviors we associate with full cognitive modernity, symbolic expression, complex hafted tool technology, the use of pigment, the use of marine resources, long-distance trade networks implied by the presence of materials carried from distant locations, was emerging and developing in southern Africa during the period from about 160,000 to 60,000 years ago. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This period, called the Middle Stone Age in the African archaeological sequence, saw several pulses of apparent behavioral sophistication, separated by periods of relative simplicity, a pattern that researchers like Sally McBrearty and Alison Brooks have argued reflects a gradual, uneven, mosaic-like emergence of modern behavior rather than a single revolutionary moment. The cognitive capacity for modern behavior was there all along. What varied was the social and environmental context that called it forth and sustained it. By roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, something had changed. The archaeological record of sub-Saharan Africa in this period shows a level of behavioral complexity, of technological sophistication, of social networking implied by the distribution of materials across the landscape that had not been reached in the same way before. The people were ready in the sense that they now possessed the cognitive and social toolkit to do something their ancestors could not. They could colonize an unknown world. They could carry enough knowledge, enough social complexity, enough technological flexibility to survive in environments utterly different from the ones that had shaped them. And the environmental conditions, the specific arrangement of climate and geography that would make the crossing possible, were about to align. The passage they used, or at least the one that left a clear genetic signal in the populations that spread across the rest of the world, was almost certainly the southern route out of Africa, through what is now the Horn of Africa and across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, at the southern end of the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula. The Bab el-Mandeb, whose name in Arabic means the Gate of Tears, is today a body of water roughly 30 kilometers across at its narrowest point. 68,000 years ago, with global sea levels perhaps 70 to 90 meters lower than today, because so much water was locked up in the expanded ice sheets of the last glacial maximum that was then approaching. The passage was narrower still. Some models suggest it may have been crossable on foot, or very nearly so, with only a short stretch of open water requiring some kind of watercraft, or even just a raft of lash vegetation to bridge. The Arabian Peninsula that the first emigrants entered was not the vast, sun-blasted desert it is today. During the window of time that the genetic and some of the archaeological evidence points to as the crossing period, roughly 65 to 75,000 years ago, Arabia was in one of its periodic green phases, its wadis flowing with fresh water, its landscape dotted with lakes, its lowlands covered in grass and scrub that supported populations of the large game animals that were the dietary staple of these mobile hunter-gatherer groups. The green Arabia that existed during certain humid intervals of the Pleistocene has been documented through an increasingly rich set of paleohydrological and paleoclimatic studies, including the discovery by Michael Petraglia and his team of ancient lake beds and stone tools distributed across the interior of what is now the Empty Quarter, one of the most desolate environments on Earth. In a humid phase, Arabia was not a barrier. It was a corridor, an invitation. And yet the invitation was not permanent. The green phases came and went. The climate that opened Arabia to human passage would eventually close it again, pushing the water table down, drying the lakes, returning the desert to its dominion over the landscape. The window within which a group of people carrying their children and their tools and their accumulated cultural knowledge could walk into Arabia and survive there long enough to move on was a real window, not a permanent condition. Timing mattered. The people who made it through were not simply the ones who tried. They were the ones who tried at the right moment, in the right climatic phase, with the right suite of skills and social organization to push deep enough into the New World before the window began to close. The genetic evidence for the out-of-Africa dispersal is, in many ways, more precise and more revealing than the archaeological evidence, because DNA does not decay the way bone does, not in living cells. Every person alive today carries in their genome a record of the population history of our species, encoded in patterns of genetic variation that can be read with increasingly sophisticated statistical tools as a kind of compressed history of who beget whom and how many of them there were, and when they separated from related populations and where they went. The field of ancient DNA analysis has transformed this reading in the past decade, adding the ability to extract and sequence genetic material directly from ancient human bones, creating a direct rather than inferred connection between the people of the past and the patterns we observe in the living. The clearest signal of the out-of-Africa dispersal in the genetic record is what population geneticists call the founder effect. When a small group breaks away from a larger population and moves into a new territory, it carries with it only a fraction of the genetic diversity of the original population. All the genetic variants that were present in the parent population but not present in the small founding group simply do not make it into the new territory. The descendants of the founding group therefore show lower genetic diversity than the parent population, and their genetic variants are a subset of those found in the original. This founder effect signal grows stronger with each successive bottleneck, each moment when a small group broke off from a slightly larger one to move further into the new world. The genetic diversity of human populations around the world shows precisely this pattern. African populations contain the highest genetic diversity of any human populations on Earth. They carry the broadest spectrum of genetic variants. As you move away from Africa in any direction, genetic diversity decreases in a pattern that is consistent with successive founder effects, as small groups moved progressively further from the source population. The populations of the Americas, the last continental region to be colonized, show the lowest genetic diversity of any major regional group, consistent with having been founded by a small group that had itself descended from a small founding group, that had itself descended from a sequence of previous founding events stretching back across the Eurasian landmass to the original African emigrants. This pattern of decreasing genetic diversity with increasing geographic distance from Africa, called the serial founder effect, is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for the out-of-Africa model of human dispersal, and it has been replicated across dozens of independent genetic datasets. The founding group itself, the people who made the initial crossing and whose descendants eventually populated the rest of the world, was astonishingly small. The most widely cited estimates, derived from statistical modeling of modern genetic diversity in non-African populations, suggest a founding effective population size of somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 individuals, and some models produce estimates even lower, in the range of a few hundred. The effective population size, to be clear, is not the same as the actual number of people who crossed. It is a statistical quantity that reflects the amount of genetic diversity in the founding group, which in turn reflects how many individuals contributed reproductively to the lineage that eventually spread. A group with very unequal reproductive success, where most reproduction is concentrated in a few individuals, will have an effective population size much smaller than its actual headcount. The real crossing party may have numbered more than the effective population size implies. But even so, the signal is of a very small, very genetically constrained group of people standing at the gateway of a new world. Among the most astonishing discoveries in the genetics of human prehistory, in a field full of astonishing discoveries, is the finding that the people who left Africa did not enter an empty world. There were already human beings in it. Not Homo sapiens, but close relatives of ours, members of our extended family, species that had left Africa in earlier migrations and had been living in Eurasia and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. And the modern human emigrants met them, and reproduced with them, and carried the genetic evidence of that encounter in their cells across all the subsequent miles and all the subsequent millennia, until it finally showed up in a laboratory in Leipzig in the second decade of the 21st century. The Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, had lived in Europe and Western Asia for at least 400,000 years by the time the first modern humans arrived. They were not the brutish, slouching half-apes of early scientific illustration. They were large-brained, often larger brained than us, cold-adapted, skilled hunters of large Pleistocene megafauna, makers of complex hafted tools of the Mousterian tradition, users of pigment, producers of ornaments, and almost certainly capable of some form of language. They had been shaping their corner of the world for nearly 500,000 years. When the first modern humans arrived in the Levant, the ancient land bridge between Africa and Eurasia, somewhere around 50,000 years ago or perhaps earlier, the two groups encountered each other. The genetic analysis of ancient Neanderthal DNA, pioneered by Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute, and published in landmark papers in 2010 and after, has shown beyond reasonable doubt that this encounter involved interbreeding. Modern humans outside of Africa carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. The mixing was real, it was not trivial, and its consequences were not merely genealogical. Some of the Neanderthal genetic variants that were absorbed into the modern human gene pool appear to have been adaptive, providing advantages in immunity, in cold tolerance, in aspects of metabolism suited to the environments of northern Eurasia. The Neanderthals, even in extinction, gave us something. And then there were the Denisovans. The Denisovans were not known to science at all until 2010, when Pääbo's team extracted DNA from a small finger bone found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, and found that it belonged to a population genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. No complete Denisovan skeleton has yet been found. We know them almost entirely from their DNA, from a handful of fragmentary bones and teeth, and from the genetic legacy they left in the populations of modern humans who encountered them. That legacy is found primarily in the populations of Australasia and Southeast Asia, where some groups, particularly indigenous Australians and Papuans, carry up to 5 or 6% Denisovan DNA. The Denisovans ranged across a vast swath of Eastern Asia, from the cold mountains of Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, and the modern humans moving east and south encountered them, just as they had encountered the Neanderthals in the West. The meeting and the interbreeding happened more than once, and in more than one location, as the genetic evidence makes clear from the different proportions and character of Denisovan ancestry in different modern populations. The world that the first modern humans entered when they crossed the Bab el-Mandeb was not the empty world that earlier models imagined. It was a world with residents, with other kinds of people, or at least with other kinds of hominins who were people in most of the ways that matter. The Out of Africa story is not the story of a species moving into virgin territory. It is the story of a species moving into a world already shaped, in various ways and to various degrees, by the activities of its relatives, and then absorbing those relatives, genetically and perhaps culturally, into itself as it went. This is one of the parts of the story that I find most affecting, and I want to sit with it for a moment before we follow the emigrants further on their path. Because there is a way of thinking about the Neanderthals and the Denisovans that treats them as simply gone, as extinct, as a closed chapter in the Book of Life. And in the strict taxonomic sense, they are. There are no living Neanderthals, but in a more literal sense, they are not entirely gone. They are in us, fragments of their genomes, the specific combinations of nucleotides that were shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation to the environments they lived in, are present in living human cells right now, expressed in the biology of billions of people. The Neanderthal and the Denisovan are not simply ancestors of ours in the genealogical sense. They are, in part, us. The boundary between species, always somewhat permeable in practice, was crossed in both directions, and what crossed it did not disappear. It persisted. The people moving east and northeast through the Arabian Peninsula, and then along the coasts of southern Asia, carried this complexity with them. They were not a pure lineage. They were already, before they had gone very far, a mixture, shaped by the encounters they had had with the people who lived in the lands they were entering. They carried new genetic material from those encounters. They may have carried new cultural knowledge as well, practices and technologies and ecological understandings that they learned from or developed in contact with the peoples they met. The migration was not a simple wave of replacement. It was a complicated, messy, biologically and culturally entangled process in which the newcomers and the residents were transformed by their encounter with each other, even as the ultimate demographic outcome, the spread of modern human populations across the globe, proceeded. The archaeology of the dispersal route through Arabia and the Indian subcontinent has, in the past 2 decades, undergone a quiet revolution. For much of the 20th century, Arabia was largely a blank on the paleoanthropological map, assumed to be too arid and too featureless to have supported significant human populations during the Pleistocene. The empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, the vast sand sea that covers a large portion of the Arabian Peninsula, seem to confirm the intuition that Arabia was simply desert, always had been desert, and could not have played a significant role in the human dispersal. That assumption has been comprehensively overturned. The Paleodeserts Project, led by Michael Petraglia of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and involving researchers from multiple countries, has used a combination of remote sensing, paleoclimatic modeling, and systematic archaeological survey to document the prehistoric landscape of Arabia in extraordinary detail. What has emerged is a picture of a peninsula that, during the humid intervals of the Pleistocene, was transformed into a landscape of lakes, rivers, and grasslands that would have been extraordinarily attractive to mobile hunter-gatherer populations. Ancient lake beds, detectable from satellite imagery as subtle differences in ground color and texture, are distributed across the interior of the peninsula. Associated with many of these lake beds are stone tools, hand axes and flakes and blade cores that speak to the presence of human populations using these lakes as base camps during the wet phases. Some of the tools found at Arabian sites belong to industries that are recognizably African in character. Aculean hand axes of a type made by Homo heidelbergensis and early Homo sapiens in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Others belong to industries that are more ambiguous, potentially made by Neanderthals moving south from the Levant, or by early modern humans who had already diverged substantially from their African parent populations. The question of exactly which populations were using Arabian resources during which humid intervals, and how the movements of these different groups related to each other and to the eventual dispersal of modern humans, is one of the most actively investigated problems in Pleistocene archaeology today. The site of Al-Wusta in Saudi Arabia, excavated by a team including Iyad Zalmout, and described in a Nature Ecology and Evolution paper in 2018, produced a fossil finger bone dated to approximately 88,000 years ago that was identified as anatomically modern human. This is one of the oldest modern human fossils found outside of Africa and the Levant, and its location in what was then a lakeshore environment in the interior of Arabia is exactly what the Green Arabia model would predict. It pushes the evidence for modern human presence outside Africa back further than the genetic dispersal date that most models favor, raising the possibility that there were earlier unsuccessful excursions out of Africa that did not produce the lasting genetic legacy of the primary dispersal, or that the timeline of the primary dispersal is earlier than the genetic data suggests. The archaeological sites of the Indian subcontinent tell a complementary story. For a long time, the dominant view was that the stone tool industries of India showed no clear break at the time of modern human arrival, suggesting that the transition was subtle and that the Middle Paleolithic industries of India were the product of populations that had been in India for hundreds of thousands of years, long before modern humans arrived from Africa. More recent work has complicated this picture. Sites in southern India, including the important sequence at Jwalapuram in Andhra Pradesh, excavated by Michael Petraglia, show layers of stone tools below the Toba ash layer, the ash deposited by the 74,000-year-old Toba eruption, and a continuation of similar tool types above it, which could indicate that populations in India survived the Toba eruption. The identity of these populations, whether they were archaic Homo sapiens, modern humans who had arrived before Toba, or a different hominin population entirely, is debated. What is clearer from the genetic evidence is that modern humans were in India by at least 65,000 years ago, and that the populations that moved through India left a genetic legacy in the populations of southern Asia that is distinct from the legacy left in East Asia and the Americas, consistent with the multiple wave model of dispersal. The indigenous populations of the Andaman Islands, a small archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, are of particular interest. The Andamanese are genetically isolated, having experienced little gene flow from outside the islands in the millennia since their ancestors arrived, and their genetic profile places them among the earliest diverging branches of the out of Africa lineage outside of Africa itself. They are, in a real sense, a living fragment of the first dispersal, their genome preserving a snapshot of the population that moved along the southern coast of Asia before the later waves of migration that brought the ancestors of most modern East and South Asians. The tools that the migrants carried through Arabia and India were not identical to the tools they had made in Africa. Migration is also adaptation, and the people moving through new environments were encountering new raw materials, new ecological challenges, new prey species whose habits required new hunting strategies, and new climatic conditions that imposed new demands on their technology and their social organization. The stone tool industries of India show regional variation and local innovation consistent with populations that were adapting to the specific conditions of the Indian subcontinent, rather than simply replicating what they had done in Africa. The scrapers and points and blades they made reflect the specific stones available in specific regions, worked with skills learned in Africa but applied to new material in new contexts. The movement through Southeast Asia toward Australia adds yet another dimension. The people who eventually made the crossing into Sahul, the combined Australian and New Guinean landmass, had been moving through the islands and peninsulas of what is now Indonesia for some time before they reached the channel that required watercraft. The islands of Wallacea, the zone between the continental shelves of Asia and Australia, where even the lowest sea stands of the Pleistocene left open water, were themselves stepping stones, each one a new island environment requiring new adaptations and offering new resources. The colonization of each island in the Wallacean chain before the final crossing to Sahul was itself a series of water crossings, each one a demonstration of the maritime capability that the final, longer crossing required. By the time the first people looked across the Timor Sea toward Australia, they had already made multiple shorter crossings. They were in the limited but real sense that applies to prehistoric people, experienced mariners. The sites of Majid Baby and other early Australian localities do not preserve the watercraft that made the crossing possible, because organic materials do not survive for 50,000 years in tropical environments. They preserve the stone tools, and the ochre and the ground edge axes, and the other durable artifacts that the first Australians brought with them, all made on arrival. The ground edge axes at Majid Baby are among the oldest in the world, predating similar technologies in other regions by tens of thousands of years, and their presence at a site this old is a reminder that the people who colonized Australia were not technologically backward or cognitively simple. They were fully modern humans carrying a toolkit of real sophistication, adapted in some respects specifically to the challenges of the environment they were about to enter, and capable of developing new innovations, including the ground edge axe that may have had no precedent in the toolkit they brought from Africa. The archaeology of the dispersal route, from Blombos Cave in South Africa to the lake beds of Arabia to the volcanic ash layers of India, to the ochre-stained stone tools of Majid Bebe, is a physical record of one of the most consequential journeys in the history of any species. Each artifact in that record is the trace of a specific person's action, a specific hand that held a specific stone and struck it in a specific way for a specific purpose on a specific day that was for the person who lived it. Not a historic moment, but an ordinary moment in an ordinary life. The archaeological record is a record of ordinary lives accumulated across generations until the accumulation becomes, from our perspective, something extraordinary. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The path from Blombos to Majid Bebe, walked in individual steps by individual people who did not know they were walking it, is the path from which every subsequent chapter of human history follows. It is the beginning of everything that came after. The route east from Arabia followed for a time the coastline. This is the model that has gained the most traction in recent decades, and it is supported by both genetic and archaeological evidence, though the direct archaeological evidence is frustratingly sparse for a reason we will come to in a moment. The coastal route hypothesis proposes that the initial dispersal from Africa moved quickly along the coastlines of southern Arabia, the Indian subcontinent, and eventually Southeast Asia, following a narrow band of productive littoral habitat, the zone where land meets sea, where shellfish and fish and coastal plants provided a reliable and calorie-rich food base that allowed rapid movement through regions that might have been much more difficult to traverse if the emigrants had been dependent entirely on terrestrial game. The coastlines were highways, not the exposed, steep-cliffed coastlines of certain dramatic geographies, but the gentle, low-lying, resource-rich margins of tropical and subtropical seas. The kind of coast where tidal flats teem with shellfish, where mangroves harbour fish and crustaceans, where river mouths create zones of extraordinary ecological productivity. People who had learned, as the Middle Stone Age Africans clearly had, to exploit marine and coastal resources were equipped for rapid movement along such coasts. The skill set that produced the perforated shells and the fish bones at Blombos Cave was precisely the skill set that would allow a group of people to move quickly and successfully through a new coastal environment, reading the tidal patterns, finding the shellfish beds, netting or trapping fish in the river mouths, and moving on. The problem with finding direct evidence of this coastal migration is elegant in its cruelty. The coastlines of 60 to 70,000 years ago, the very coastlines that the first emigrants walked, are underwater. The sea level rise that accompanied the end of the last glacial maximum, roughly 18,000 years ago, raised global sea levels by approximately 120 meters. Every coastal site that the first emigrants occupied along the shores of Arabia and India and Southeast Asia is now beneath the Indian Ocean, at depths that make conventional archaeological investigation essentially impossible. The camps and middens and hearths that might show us, directly and unambiguously, the path of the coastal migration are sitting under hundreds of meters of water, inaccessible to the tools we currently have. We know they must exist. We cannot reach them. What we can do is read the genetic evidence of the movement, and here the signal is extraordinary in its speed. The genetic data suggests that once the crossing was made, the dispersal through southern Asia and into Australia happened very rapidly, perhaps within 5,000 to 10,000 years. A rate of movement of roughly 10 to 20 kilometers per year, sustained across generations of people who were not consciously trying to colonize a continent, but simply moving when local resources required it or opportunity beckoned it, is enough to carry a population from the Arabian coast to the shore of what is now Australia in that time frame. And what the genetic evidence suggests about the timing is confirmed by the archaeological evidence from Australia itself. Majid Bebe, a rock shelter in the Northern Territory of Australia, has produced stone tools and ochre and evidence of human occupation dated by Zenobia Jacobs and Richard Roberts and their colleagues to at least 65,000 years ago, and perhaps earlier. This is the oldest well-documented evidence of human presence in Australia, and it has been a source of productive debate within the archaeological community about both the methodology of the dating and the implications for the dispersal timeline. But even the most conservative interpretations of the Australian evidence push human arrival back to at least 50,000 years ago, and the genetic modelling is consistent with arrival in this range. Getting to Australia required something specific. It required boats, or at least it required watercraft of some kind, because even during the lowest sea stands of the Pleistocene, when the sea level was at its minimum, and the shallow seas of the Sunda Shelf, the continental shelf of Southeast Asia, were exposed as dry land, creating the landmass paleoecologists call Sundaland. There was still open ocean between Sundaland and the Australian landmass. The channel between them, part of what is called the Wallace Line, the biogeographic boundary between the Asian and Australian faunal zones, was never dry. It was always water. It was sometimes shallower and narrower than it is today, perhaps 70 to 90 kilometers across at its narrowest during the glacial low stand. But it was always open water. There was no way to walk to Australia. You had to sail, or at least float. This is one of the most significant behavioral inferences in all of Pleistocene archaeology. The ancestors of the first Australians had watercraft. They had the navigational knowledge and the confidence to deliberately embark on a crossing of open water with no certain knowledge of what, if anything, lay on the other side. This was not accidental. You do not drift across 90 kilometers of the Timor Sea on a log. You plan a crossing. You build something capable of carrying people and provisions. You read the winds and the currents. You go in the right season. The level of maritime technology and navigational knowledge implied by human arrival in Australia is extraordinary, and it was present in our species at least 50,000 years ago, perhaps much earlier. The world the first Australians arrived in was the world of Pleistocene Australia, a world almost beyond imagining from the perspective of anyone familiar with the modern continent. The megafauna of Ice Age Australia included creatures that had no parallel anywhere else on Earth. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever lived, was the size of a modern rhinoceros and browsed the semi-arid woodlands. Procoptodon goliah, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood 2 meters tall and probably could not hop in the way living kangaroos do, its leg bones suggesting a walking or shuffling gait unlike anything in the modern marsupial world. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, was a heavily built predator with enormous shearing premolars capable of delivering a killing bite unlike any living carnivore. Megalania prisca, a monitor lizard of staggering proportions, possibly reaching 6 or 7 meters in length, hunted the open woodlands. Genyornis newtoni, a large flightless bird, grazed the grasslands in flocks. The continent was alive with animals that had never seen a human being. Animals whose behavioral repertoire had no defensive response to the particular combination of social coordination, projectile weapons, and fire that the arriving humans brought with them. The fate of the Australian megafauna is one of the most debated questions in Pleistocene paleoecology. The extinctions, which appear to have occurred between roughly 50,000 and 46,000 years ago, have been attributed by different researchers to human hunting pressure, to climate change, to fire management that altered vegetation communities, and to various combinations of all three. The debate is not fully resolved, and the evidence from different sites and different species points in different directions, but the timing is suggestive. The megafauna had survived multiple previous glacial-interglacial cycles without mass extinction. The novel element in the late Pleistocene was the arrival of human beings. Whatever the specific mechanisms, the ecological impact of that arrival was profound. and the Australia that the descendants of the first arrivals would inhabit for the next 50+ millennia was an ecologically transformed version of the world those first arrivals had stepped onto. The colonization of Australia was, in one sense, the end of a chapter. The southern route out of Africa, the coastal highway through Arabia and India and Southeast Asia, had reached its furthest point. The continent was occupied, but the migration had not only gone east and south. From the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, other groups had moved north and west and northeast, into the heart of Eurasia, into the landscapes of Neanderthal territory, into the cold and demanding environments of Ice Age Europe. And that branch of the story produced its own remarkable chapter. Europe, 45,000 years ago. The ice had not yet reached its maximum extent that would come later, around 26 to 19,000 years ago, but the continent was already cold and harsh by any tropical standard. The northern latitudes were tundra and periglacial steppe, swept by winds off the ice sheets to the north and east. The central and southern latitudes were a mosaic of boreal forest, grassland, and river valleys, richly stocked with large game animals, woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, cave bear, cave lion, wild horse, aurochs, reindeer, bison, ibex, but demanding in their climate and in the cognitive and technological requirements they placed on any group of people trying to survive through a continental winter, with temperatures that could reach 40 degrees below zero in the interior. The Neanderthals had been doing it for a very long time. Their anatomy told the story of cold adaptation. They were robustly built, with large noses that humidified and warmed the frigid air before it reached their lungs, with a barrel-chested body plan that conserved heat, with dense bones and powerful musculature suited to the close-range hunting of large, dangerous prey animals. They had fire. They made complex hafted tools, attaching stone points to wooden hafts using birch tar adhesive that required a specific, multi-step preparation process. There is evidence from certain Neanderthal sites of personal ornaments, of the collection of eagle talons and raptor feathers for what may have been decorative or symbolic use, of the use of pigment on the body or on objects in the environment. The old picture of the Neanderthal as a barely conscious brute was wrong. These were people with minds of real power and lives of genuine complexity. And yet, within a few thousand years of modern human arrival in Europe, the Neanderthals were gone. The last secure evidence of living Neanderthals dates to approximately 40,000 years ago, in the Iberian Peninsula, which appears to have been one of the last refugia where Neanderthal populations persisted, as modern humans spread through the rest of the continent. Whether that replacement was violent, whether the two populations competed directly, and the modern humans won through superior technology or social organization or reproductive rate, or whether the Neanderthals simply faded through a combination of small population size, limited genetic diversity, and the absorption of their genes into the expanding modern human population, is a question that the current evidence cannot fully resolve. The genetic data tells us mixing occurred. The archaeological data tells us the transition was geographically uneven and took perhaps 5,000 years across the continent. The outcome is not in doubt. What modern humans brought into Europe that Neanderthals apparently did not have, or did not have in the same elaborated form, was the Upper Paleolithic technological and cultural package. This was a suite of innovations that appeared apparently quite suddenly in the archaeological record, with the arrival of modern humans in Europe around 45,000 years ago, and that transformed the character of human material culture in ways so dramatic that archaeologists of an earlier era called it a revolution, the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Blade technology, the production of long, thin, standardized stone flakes from carefully prepared cores, dramatically increased the yield of cutting edge per kilogram of raw material. Personal ornaments, perforated shells and animal teeth and ivory beads appear in enormous numbers. Musical instruments, bone flutes, appear at some of the earliest Upper Paleolithic sites. And above all, the visual arts. Painting, engraving, sculpture, the production of images of animals and of human forms, and of abstract symbols on surfaces of stone and bone and ivory, at a level of quantity and sophistication that has no parallel in the earlier archaeological record anywhere in the world. The Chauvet Cave in the Ardèche region of southern France contains some of the oldest known cave paintings in the world, dated by radiocarbon to somewhere between 32,000 and 36,000 years ago. Jean-Marie Chauvet and two colleagues discovered the cave in December 1994, and what they found inside it, behind a collapsed rock wall that had sealed the entrance for approximately 22,000 years, was staggering. Animals painted with a mastery of line and perspective that had not been supposed possible in a human tradition this old. Rhinoceroses, lions, bears, horses, mammoth, rendered in black and red pigment on the cave walls with a confidence and accuracy that speaks to an artistic tradition of real depth and sophistication. The lions at Chauvet are depicted in a way that conveys motion, that suggests weight and musculature, that shows an observational acuity about animal behavior that could only come from long and intimate familiarity with the living animals. Whoever painted those lions had watched them carefully, repeatedly, with the kind of sustained and specific attention that is itself a form of relationship. The cave art of Upper Paleolithic Europe, found at hundreds of sites across France and Spain and beyond, from the famous painted halls of Lascaux and Altamira to the more recently discovered sites at El Castillo, La Pasiega, and Ardales, represents one of the most profound expressions of human cognitive and cultural capacity in the prehistoric record. These were not accidental marks. They were deliberate, sustained, technically sophisticated productions that required planning, preparation of materials, physical access to deep and often difficult cave systems, and a shared symbolic tradition that spanned generations and hundreds of kilometers. The bison at Lascaux and the rhinoceroses at Chauvet belong to the same tradition, recognizably, even though they are separated by 17,000 years and hundreds of kilometers. That kind of cultural continuity across such a span of time is itself extraordinary evidence of the power of the social and symbolic systems that are developed in this population of modern humans. What was the cave art for? This is a question that has generated more discussion and more disagreement in prehistoric archaeology than almost any other. And the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The early 20th century interpretation by scholars like the Abbé Henri Brouy proposed that the paintings were hunting magic, produced to ensure success in the chase. This idea has largely fallen out of favor, partly because many of the most abundantly depicted animals, lions, rhinoceroses, bears, were not primary prey animals, and partly because the spatial distribution of images in the caves does not obviously map onto a ritual structure that matches the hunting magic hypothesis. More recent interpretations have emphasized the role of the deep cave as a liminal space, a boundary between the surface world and another realm, and the paintings as part of ritual practices that may have involved altered states of consciousness, initiation ceremonies, or the maintenance of relationships with spirit entities associated with the animal world. David Lewis Williams, a South African rock art scholar, has developed an influential neuropsychological model that connects Upper Paleolithic cave art to the visual phenomena produced by altered states, including the distinctive entoptic patterns, the geometric forms that appear alongside animal figures at many sites. What seems beyond doubt is that the people who made these paintings inhabited a rich, symbolic, and spiritual world, that they had a relationship with the animal species they depicted that went far beyond the purely practical, and that the cave, as a space for significant cultural activity, was embedded in a complex web of social and ritual meaning that we can glimpse only imperfectly through the images and objects that survive. The people who painted Chauvet were anatomically and cognitively identical to us. They were us. And the world they lived in, cold and dangerous and full of enormous animals, was also a world of extraordinary imaginative richness. A world in which the human mind had already turned its full power toward the creation of beauty and the making of meaning. There are moments in the dispersal story where the evidence becomes almost unbearably specific, where a name or a face or a specific set of circumstances crystallizes out of the vast anonymity of deep time, and the distance between us and the people we are following suddenly collapses. These moments are rare. The fossil record of the dispersal period, outside of Africa, is fragmentary in the extreme, because the environments through which the first emigrants moved were tropical and subtropical, and bone does not last well in warm, wet conditions. But where the evidence does survive, it is worth pausing on, because it transforms the abstraction of the dispersal into something with a human face. The School and Kafse caves in what is now Israel are among the most important sites in the entire Out of Africa story. At School, a cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel near the modern city of Haifa, a series of burials was discovered by Dorothy Garrod and Theodore McCown in the 1930s. The bones they found were anatomically modern, clearly Homo sapiens in their skull shape and overall morphology, and they were associated with ornaments and with what appear to be deliberate burial practices. Some of the individuals had been interred with animal bones. A boar's mandible placed in the arms of one individual in what may have been an intentional grave good. The School burials date to approximately 100,000 to 130,000 years ago, making them among the oldest evidence for modern human presence outside of Africa. They represent an early, and probably ultimately unsuccessful, excursion from Africa into the Levant, one that does not appear to have left a significant genetic legacy in later populations, but that demonstrates that the impulse and the capability for dispersal were present in the species long before the main event. At Kafse Cave, near Nazareth in the same region, similar modern human burials were found by René Neuville in the 1930s, and excavated more systematically by Bernard van der Meersch in the 1960s and 70s. One of the Kafse individuals, a young woman who died perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, was buried in a double grave with a young child at her feet. The child's skull had been placed near her feet, and both individuals appear to have been interred with deliberate care. This woman, 100,000 years old, whose name we will never know and whose language we could never speak, was buried as someone who mattered, by people who thought it important to mark her passing in a specific and organized way. The burial implies not just grief in the immediate sense, because grief in the presence of death is common to many social animals, but a set of beliefs, or at least intuitions about what death means and what the dead deserve that is specifically human in its character. The Pesteracu Oase, the cave with bones in Romania, produced in 2002 the skull of a young man who lived approximately 35 to 40,000 years ago, and who was, at the time of discovery, the oldest modern human fossil known from Europe. The Oase individual is significant not only for his age, but for his genomic profile, which shows a remarkably high proportion of Neanderthal ancestry, perhaps 6 to 9%, suggesting that one of his recent ancestors, within the previous 4 to 6 generations, was a Neanderthal. He represents direct evidence of the interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals that the genomic data of living people only implies at many removes. His Neanderthal ancestry is too high and too recent to have been inherited through a long chain of dilution. He had a Neanderthal great-grandparent, or something very close to it. He is a face for the mixing that the genetics predicted, a specific individual whose specific ancestry bridges the two populations at a specific place and time. The Tianyuan cave individual from China, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, is one of the oldest modern humans known from East Asia. His genome, sequenced from his bones by Svante Pääbo's group and analyzed by Xiaomei Fu and colleagues, shows that he belonged to a population ancestral to many modern East Asians and Native Americans, consistent with his position on the dispersal route between the Levant and the furthest reaches of the migration. He is a data point on the line from Africa to the Americas, a specific person at a specific location at a specific time in the great chain of movement. These individuals, the woman of Kafse, the man of Pesteraku Oasis, the Tianyuan individual, and the many others whose bones lie in caves and riverbanks and archaeological sites across the world, are the dispersal made concrete. They are the proof that the journey was not an abstraction, but a series of specific lives, lived in specific places by specific people who were born and loved and died in the way that all people are born and love and die. The genetic and archaeological frameworks that we use to describe the dispersal are powerful and necessary tools for understanding a process of enormous geographic and temporal scale. But if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. But behind every data point in those frameworks is a person. A person who woke up one morning 60 or 80 or 100,000 years ago in a world that was genuinely strange and dangerous, and went about the business of being alive in the best way they knew how. The dispersal was made of those days, of those specific, unremarkable, irretrievably lost mornings, accumulated across thousands of generations, until the accumulation became the world. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, occurred roughly between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago. At its height, the ice sheets of the northern hemisphere covered an area larger than the modern continent of Africa. The Laurentide ice sheet buried most of Canada and the northern United States under a kilometre or more of ice. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered northern Europe from Ireland to the Ural Mountains. Sea level was at its lowest point, roughly 120 to 130 meters below present. The exposed continental shelves created vast new land masses. Sundalen connected what are now the islands of Southeast Asia into a single large peninsula. Sahul connected what are now Australia and New Guinea into a single continent. And Beringia, the land bridge between northeastern Asia and northwestern North America, was broad enough not merely to allow crossing, but to constitute a substantial landmass in its own right, hundreds of kilometers wide, covered in a cold but productive steppe tundra vegetation that supported substantial populations of large mammals. Beringia was not a corridor in the sense of a narrow passage to be crossed quickly. It was a world inhabited by mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and bison and horses and giant ground sloths, and at some point during or before the last glacial maximum, by human beings who had been moving steadily northeast across the Siberian steppe for millennia. The Denisovans had been in Siberia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. The Neanderthals had extended into western Siberia, but the populations of modern humans who reached northeastern Siberia, following the game herds across the great steppes of Asia, were the first Homo sapiens to stand on what is now American soil, even if they did not realize they had crossed from one world into another. The timing of the first human arrival in the Americas is one of the most actively debated questions in all of Pleistocene archaeology, and the debate has grown more complex, not less, as new sites have been excavated and new dating methods applied. The traditional model, dominant for most of the 20th century, proposed that the first Americans entered through an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets that opened around 14,000 years ago as the glaciers began to retreat, and spread rapidly south through North America and into South America, accounting for the archaeological sites that cluster around this date throughout the continent. The bearers of this earliest well-documented American archaeological culture are called the Clovis people, named for the distinctive fluted stone projectile points first found near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s. But the simple Clovis first model has been under sustained pressure for decades, from a growing body of evidence suggesting that people were in the Americas before the ice-free corridor opened. The site of Monteverde in southern Chile, excavated by Tom Dillehay and his colleagues, produced evidence of human occupation dated to approximately 14,600 years ago, making it coeval with or older than the earliest Clovis sites in North America. For people to have been in southern Chile at this date, they would need to have been in the Americas significantly earlier, before the ice-free corridor was open, because southern Chile is a very long way from Beringia, and Monteverde has been joined by other sites whose dates push occupation claims even further back. The Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho has produced evidence dated to perhaps 16,000 years ago. The Chiquihuite cave site in Mexico has yielded dates that, if accepted, push human presence back to 26,000 or even 30,000 years ago, though these dates remain controversial and are not accepted by all researchers. The resolution to these apparent contradictions, if there is one, appears to involve the coast. A kelp highway hypothesis has gained traction in recent years, proposing that the first Americans did not enter through the interior, ice-free corridor, but along the Pacific coast, by boat or on foot along ice-free coastal stretches, before the corridor opened. The productive kelp forest ecosystems of the North Pacific coast, rich in marine mammals, shellfish, and fish, could have supported rapid movement southward along a coastal route that would have required watercraft for some stretches, but would have been navigable for people with the maritime skills that the colonization of Australia had already demonstrated our species possessed. The coastal sites that would show this migration directly are, once again, underwater, drowned by the sea level rise of the post-glacial period. But the genetic evidence for the population history of indigenous Americans, increasingly rich as ancient DNA from skeletal remains across the continent has been analysed, is consistent with a coastal entry model involving one or more founding populations that entered before the interior corridor opened. By about 13,000 years ago, whatever the specific route or routes of entry, human beings were present throughout the Americas, from Alaska to the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego. The speed of this dispersal, measured against the distances involved, is staggering. From the Bering Land Bridge to the tip of South America is roughly 17,000 kilometers. If people entered through an interior corridor around 14,000 years ago, they covered that distance across an enormous variety of environments, climates, and ecological communities in less than 2,000 years. Roughly 8 kilometers per year, on average, sustained across generations of people who were simultaneously learning entirely new ecologies, developing new technologies suited to new environments, managing the social dynamics of founding populations in new territories, and somehow, reliably, always finding enough to eat. The Americas they entered were, like Australia before them, populated with a megafauna that had never encountered humans. Mastodons and mammoths, and giant sloths and saber-toothed cats and American horses and camels. A fauna that had been developing in isolation from the human hunters of Eurasia and Africa for millions of years, and that had no behavioral response to a social, coordinated, technologically equipped predator capable of hunting from a distance. The consequences of this encounter, the wave of megafaunal extinction that moved through North and South America in the millennia following human arrival, mirrored what had happened in Australia tens of thousands of years earlier, and was probably caused by a combination of the same factors. Hunting pressure concentrated on populations with no evolved defense against this particular kind of predator, combined with climate change and habitat transformation as the glaciers retreated and the post-glacial warming reorganized the vegetation communities that the megafauna depended on. By 12,000 years ago, the journey was complete. Not in the sense that all migration had ceased. Human populations would continue to move, to expand, to colonize new territories for thousands of years to come. The islands of the Pacific, the last great uninhabited region of the planet, would not be reached until the extraordinary Polynesian expansion of the last 2,000 years. But the major continental landmasses, with the exception of Antarctica, which remains, as far as we know, uninhabited until the modern era, had been found and settled. A species that had spent most of its 300,000-year existence confined to a single continent had, in the astonishing span of perhaps 50 to 60,000 years, walked or sailed or paddled to the ends of the earth. The dispersal of modern humans out of Africa was not a passive event, not simply the movement of a species into an empty world that absorbed the newcomers without being changed by them. It was the beginning of a global ecological transformation that, by the time civilization appeared 12,000 years ago, had already fundamentally reshaped the biological communities of every continent the emigrants had reached. The world that existed at the moment of the crossing was, in terms of its large animal fauna, very different from the world that would exist at the moment the first cities were built. And the single most important factor in that difference was the arrival of modern humans. The Pleistocene megafauna, the large animals of the Ice Age world, were spectacular in their diversity and their scale. Africa, whose megafauna had co-evolved with hominins for millions of years, and therefore had developed behavioral defenses against human predation, retained most of its large animals through the dispersal period and into the present. The African elephant, the hippopotamus, the rhinoceroses, the great carnivores, the zebras and giraffes and buffalo, all of these survived, denuded in some places by the later pressures of agriculture and then of industrial civilization, but surviving as a fauna. Africa is the only continent whose megafauna survived the Pleistocene largely intact, and the reason is almost certainly that its large animals had hundreds of thousands of years of experience with bipedal hominins, and had evolved sufficient wariness to survive encounters with even the most cognitively sophisticated predators our lineage produced. The megafauna of everywhere else was not so lucky. The pattern of extinction across the globe traces the path of the dispersal with a fidelity that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. Australia lost its large animals shortly after human arrival. North America lost its mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, sloths, and a range of large carnivores within a few thousand years of human arrival. South America, colonized shortly after North America, lost an even greater proportion of its large animal fauna, including the enormous ground sloths of the genus Megatherium that weighed as much as an African elephant, and the glyptodons, tank-like armored mammals that could reach 3 meters in length. Madagascar, not colonized until roughly 2,000 years ago, lost its giant lemurs and elephant birds almost immediately after humans arrived. New Zealand, colonized by Polynesians around 800 years ago, lost its giant moas, flightless birds, some of which stood 3 meters tall within a few hundred years of human contact. This global pattern of extinction tightly correlated with human arrival, consistent across every continent and major island chain, and not correlated with any other single causal factor in a way that explains the pattern, is what makes the overkill hypothesis, the proposal that human hunting was the primary driver of Pleistocene megafaunal extinction, the most parsimonious explanation available to us. It does not require that our ancestors were deliberately exterminating species. They almost certainly were not. They were hunting what was available as efficiently as they could, without any concept of species-level depletion. The megafauna they encountered were naive, had no effective behavioral response to coordinated human hunters using projectile weapons, and reproduced slowly enough that even moderate hunting pressure could drive population decline faster than recovery was possible. The mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths went not because humans were unusually destructive, but because humans were unusually effective hunters, and the animals they encountered had never met anything quite like them before. The consequences of these extinctions, which happened before a single city was built, or a single field of grain was planted, were profound and lasting. The loss of the mega-herbivores, the large grazing and browsing animals, transformed vegetation communities in ways that are still felt today. Large herbivores are ecosystem engineers. They open landscapes by grazing and browsing and trampling. They create and maintain habitat diversity. They move seeds across landscapes in their gut and in their fur. They alter soil chemistry through their dung. The loss of the mega herbivores in North America transformed the prairies in ways that are still only partially understood. The loss of the Australian megafauna altered the fire regime of the continent in ways that made the landscape more flammable and ultimately contributed to the spread of the fire-adapted, eucalyptus-dominated vegetation that we associate with Australia today. The ecological Australia that exists now, the Australia of eucalypts and kangaroos and desert, is partly a consequence of what happened 50,000 years ago when the first humans arrived and the megafauna was lost. The first Australians were not passive observers of this ecological transformation. They were active participants in it, and they developed, over the 50,000 years of their occupation of the continent, a sophisticated system of land management that used fire as the primary tool. The practice that contemporary Aboriginal Australians call fire stick farming. The deliberate, systematic burning of portions of the landscape to promote new growth, to manage the movement of game animals, to maintain habitat diversity, and to prevent the accumulation of fuel loads that would allow catastrophically large, uncontrolled fires, is a technology of enormous sophistication that takes generations to master and requires an intimate knowledge of the specific fire responses of specific vegetation communities in specific climatic conditions. It is not fire for destruction. It is fire for gardening. Fire as the primary instrument of landscape management in a continent where the vegetation had, under the influence of the lost megaherbivores and the changing climate, become increasingly dependent on fire for its own renewal. The evidence for systematic human burning of the Australian landscape goes back tens of thousands of years, well before the late Holocene period for which the historical and ethnographic record is richest. The charcoal record in lake sediments across Australia shows increases in fire frequency that correlate with human arrival and that persist across the full span of Aboriginal occupation, with patterns that are consistent with deliberate management rather than the random ignition of lightning-caused fires. The mosaic landscape that many ecological surveys of pre-European Australia describe, with its patchwork of different vegetation ages and heights, maintained by the regular burning practices of Aboriginal groups, was not a natural landscape in the sense of a landscape uninfluenced by human activity. It was a managed landscape, the product of 50,000 years of deliberate ecological intervention by a people who understood their environment with a depth and precision that was the product of that extraordinary span of continuous experience. Similar fire management traditions existed in the Americas, where indigenous peoples across the continent used controlled burning to manage landscapes for improved hunting, travel, and foraging. The prairie landscapes of North America, long assumed to be a natural product of climate and soil, were partly maintained by the burning practices of the peoples who lived within them. The park-like open forests that early European settlers described in many parts of eastern North America were the product of burning traditions that had been maintained for centuries or millennia. When those burning traditions were disrupted by European colonization and the displacement or destruction of the peoples who practiced them, the vegetation communities changed, often dramatically. What all of this tells us is that the dispersal of modern humans was, from its very beginning, an ecological event as well as a demographic one. The species that left Africa was not merely a predator, it was an ecosystem engineer, capable of reshaping the biological communities it entered through a combination of hunting pressure, fire management, and the cultural transmission of ecological knowledge that allowed management practices to persist across generations. The world that modern humans inherited through the dispersal was not simply colonized, it was transformed. The transformation was not always intentional and was almost never understood in the systemic terms that a modern ecologist would apply to it. But it was real, and it was profound, and its echoes are still present in every landscape that humans have inhabited for any significant length of time. The world of 12,000 years ago when the first agricultural villages began to appear in the Fertile Crescent, was already a world substantially shaped by human presence. The megafauna was largely gone. The vegetation communities of multiple continents had been modified by millennia of deliberate and accidental burning. The prey animals that remained had, in many regions, been hunted to lower densities or had evolved over generations of selection pressure from human hunters, slightly greater wariness or faster reproductive rates than their pre-human ancestors. The first farmers did not step into a pristine nature. They stepped into a world that their ancestors had already been reshaping for 60,000 years. What they did was accelerate the transformation, intensify the intervention, and ultimately move it to a scale and a permanence that the hunter-gatherer predecessors had not achieved. But the transformation had begun with the dispersal. It had begun with the first person who crossed the water and stepped onto a shore where no human had ever walked before. What carried them there? Not just the legs, not just the boats, but the deeper architecture, the cognitive and social and cultural equipment that made it possible for small groups of human beings to move into environments utterly unlike anything their ancestors had known, and to survive there, and to pass the knowledge of that survival to their children, who moved further, who passed it further, who kept going. What is the actual substance of the toolkit that enabled the most extraordinary biological dispersal in the history of any large mammal? Language is the first and most fundamental answer. Not language as we tend to think of it, not the sophisticated grammar and vast vocabulary of a modern tongue, but something that may have been more compressed, more contextual, more dependent on gesture and shared experience than modern languages, and that was nonetheless capable of transmitting the essential information across generations. How to read a landscape for water in a desert, which plants are safe to eat and which are poisonous, the behavior patterns of prey animals in a terrain you have never hunted before, the correct technique for producing a hafted spear point from a particular type of stone, the social norms that govern who has access to which resources, and who is owed what, and what happens when someone violates the agreement. All of this information, and vastly more, flows through language and could not flow without it. A group of people without language moving into a new environment can learn what they individually experience. A group of people with language can share what any one of them has experienced, multiply the effective knowledge base of the group by the number of individuals in it, and build on that shared knowledge across generations. Language is the mechanism of the cultural ratchet, and the cultural ratchet is what makes human dispersal different from the dispersal of any other species. Fire, wherever it was controlled, transformed the human relationship to climate. The ability to generate heat on demand made environments that would otherwise be lethally cold survivable. It made food safer and more digestible, expanding the range of what could be eaten in a new environment. It made the night usable, extending the social hours, the hours of story and planning and teaching, beyond the constraints of natural light. It made shelter more effective, converting even a modest windbreak into something that could maintain a survivable interior temperature in conditions that would otherwise be fatal. The people who crossed into Siberia and eventually into Beringia had fire. They could not have done it without it. Technology, in the more specific sense of manufactured tools, was the extension of the human body into the environment. A spear is a longer arm. An atlatl, the spear-throwing device that allows a javelin to be cast with far greater force and accuracy than an arm alone can produce, is a mechanical amplifier of the throwing motion. A needle made from bone, used to sew hide clothing fitted closely to the body, is the difference between surviving an Arctic winter and dying in one. The sophistication of the Upper Paleolithic toolkit, and its continued refinement across the millennia of the dispersal, was not a luxury. It was the margin between success and extinction in the new environments the migrants entered. Each new environment demanded new solutions, new applications of existing technological principles, new materials worked in new ways. The cognitive flexibility to recognize that a principle mastered in one context could be applied in a new one, and the cultural infrastructure to transmit the new solution once it had been found was exactly what made the human dispersal unstoppable. Social organization was perhaps the subtlest and most powerful of the tools. The ability to maintain cooperative relationships with individuals who are not close kin. The ability to form and sustain alliances across groups. The ability to establish and enforce norms that allow strangers to interact without defaulting immediately to conflict. These are distinctively human social capabilities, rooted in cognitive machinery that our species had been developing for hundreds of thousands of years. A single family cannot colonize a continent. A network of related families, coordinating, trading, sharing information across a connected landscape of social ties, can. The out-of-Africa dispersal was not a series of individual journeys, but a social process, involving the maintenance of relationships across growing geographic distances, the transmission of information through networks that stretched from established settlements to the moving frontier, the management of the demographic and resource pressures that arise when population density grows in newly settled areas. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The groups at the moving edge of the dispersal were small. They had to be, because small groups are the ones that can exploit resources in a new area without immediately exhausting them, that can move when local conditions require it without the logistical impossibility of moving a large community, that can make the decisions necessary to survive without the complex social negotiation that large groups require. But small groups are vulnerable to the accidents of individual misfortune, to disease, to the loss of a crucial knowledge holder, to the demographic instability that comes with very small population size. The solution to this vulnerability was the social network that connected small mobile groups to each other, allowing individuals to move between groups when needed, allowing knowledge to flow across the network, allowing the effective population size of the dispersing system to be much larger than the size of any individual group at any given time. There was also something less tangible and harder to name that the migrants carried. A disposition toward the horizon, an orientation that valued novelty, that was motivated by the question of what was beyond the next ridge, that found the unknown attractive rather than purely threatening. This is not a universal human trait. Most people, in most circumstances, are conservative in their movement patterns, preferring the known to the unknown, the familiar landscape to the strange one. The populations at the moving frontier of the dispersal were, in all probability, not a random sample of the populations they came from. They were, disproportionately, the individuals and groups for whom the horizon was a draw rather than a threat. Whether this reflects a specific personality profile, a specific genetic variant affecting novelty-seeking behavior, or simply the accumulated cultural identity of groups whose history included successful exploration and who had therefore developed a cultural tradition that valued and celebrated it, is impossible to know. But the disposition was real, and it was consequential. The descendants of the people who crossed the Bab el-Mandeb eventually built Göbekli Tepe and Stonehenge, and the temples of Angkor, and the cities of the Indus Valley, and the pyramids of Giza, and the cathedrals of medieval Europe, and the observatories of Mesoamerica. Everything that human civilization has produced in the 12,000 years since the first agricultural villages appeared on the Fertile Crescent was produced by the descendants of the small, precarious group that stood at the edge of a continent 68,000 years ago and looked across water. Every language spoken on Earth today is descended from the language or languages that those people carried with them. Every artistic tradition, every scientific discovery, every political system, every religion, every meal cooked over a fire, and every story told in the dark traces its ultimate origin to that crossing, and to the deep African prehistory that produced the people who made it. This is the kind of thought that does not get smaller the more you think about it. It gets larger. The thread from that nameless group on the Horn of Africa to every human being alive today is unbroken. Every one of the 8 billion people on this planet is descended from people who made that journey. Every language spoken today is the descendant of languages spoken by people who walked out of Africa and kept walking. We are all, in the most literal biological sense, Africans who live somewhere else. The journey did not end. It transformed. It became cities and libraries and hospitals and concert halls and laboratories. But it is the same journey, the same motion outward, the same looking toward the horizon and deciding, without any guarantee of success, to go. Language leaves no direct fossil record. You cannot find a word in a rock formation. You cannot date a sentence by the decay of its constituent elements. The sounds that the people who crossed the Bab el-Mandeb made with their voices, the specific phonemes and grammatical structures of the language or languages they spoke, are lost with a completeness that makes the loss of the megafauna seem almost recoverable by comparison. We have the bones of the megafauna. We have nothing at all of the words. What we do have are the languages of the living. The approximately 7,000 languages spoken on Earth today are, every one of them, the descendants of languages spoken by the people who dispersed out of Africa. They are the linguistic legacy of the dispersal, transformed beyond recognition by tens of thousands of years of change, divergence, contact, borrowing, and replacement, but connected in some deep and not always traceable way to the linguistic traditions of the emigrants. Reading backward from the living languages toward the ancestral ones is one of the oldest enterprises in linguistics, and its results, while fragmentary and contested, tell us something real about the linguistic world of our ancestors. The deepest language families, the groups that encompass the largest numbers of related languages across the widest geographic areas, correspond broadly to the major branches of the human dispersal. The Niger-Congo family encompasses most of sub-Saharan Africa. The Afro-Asiatic family covers North Africa and the Middle East. The Indo-European family stretches from India to Iceland. The Sino-Tibetan family covers much of Eastern Asia. The Austronesian family, the linguistic legacy of the extraordinary maritime expansion of the Polynesian and related peoples, covers the Pacific Islands and parts of Southeast Asia, and includes languages as geographically distant from each other as Malagasy in Madagascar and Hawaiian. These families are recognizably related through shared vocabulary and grammatical structures that linguists can reconstruct, using techniques analogous to those geneticists use to reconstruct ancestral genomes from living genetic data. But the deepest connections, the ones that might reach back to the time of the dispersal itself, are harder to see and more contested. Some linguists, most notably Joseph Greenberg and his successors, have proposed large macro-families that group established language families into broader supercategories, reflecting even older connections. The Nostratic hypothesis groups Indo-European, Uralic, Altaic, and several other Eurasian families into a single ancestor. The Dene-Yeniseian connection, proposed by Edward Vajda and now fairly widely accepted, links the Na-Dene languages of North America with the Yeniseian languages of Siberia, reflecting a late prehistoric connection across the Bering Strait. These macro-level connections are productive and suggestive, but the further back you try to go, the less reliable the comparative method becomes, because languages change and languages borrow from each other so extensively over long time periods that genuine inherited similarity becomes difficult to distinguish from chance resemblance or contact-induced similarity. The Khoisan languages of southern Africa, spoken by the San and related peoples, contain sounds found nowhere else in the world's languages. The click consonants, sounds produced not by pushing air out of the lungs, but by creating a vacuum between the tongue and the palate, or the tongue and the teeth, which is then released with an audible click. These languages are phonologically extraordinary, with some inventories containing more than 100 distinct sound contrasts, more than any other language family on Earth. They are not, as was once casually assumed, primitive or simple in any sense. They are among the most phonologically complex languages in the world, and their click consonants may be an ancient feature, possibly present in the ancestral language of all humans, rather than a later innovation, though this hypothesis is controversial and not universally accepted among linguists. If the click sounds are ancient, then the languages spoken by the emigrants who crossed the Bab el-Mandeb may have been click languages, or at least languages with click consonants among their sound inventories. The fact that click sounds have been borrowed into some East African languages that are not originally Khoisan suggests that contact with click-speaking populations has been a significant force in the linguistic history of parts of Africa. The specific trajectory from ancestral click sounds to the clickless languages of most of the world requires, in this hypothesis, the loss of clicks in multiple daughter lineages, which is certainly possible since sound changes that eliminate phonemic categories are known to occur. But this remains speculative, and the honest position is that we do not know what the languages of the immigrants sounded like, at the phonemic level or at any other level. What we can say with more confidence, based on the universals of language structure, and on the nature of the cognitive capacities required to produce and process human language, is that the languages spoken by the emigrants were fully human languages. They had grammar. They had a large vocabulary, almost certainly running into the thousands of words, because the ecological knowledge base required for survival in a complex environment simply cannot be maintained without a large lexicon. They had the capacity for displacement, for reference to things not present in the immediate environment, which is one of the features that makes human language uniquely powerful as an information technology. They had the capacity for embedding and recursion, for constructing complex propositions that refer to other propositions, and for building up complex meaning from simple components according to systematic rules. These features are universal in human languages and are almost certainly universal because they are products of the evolved cognitive architecture for language that our species carries. The languages spoken by the descendants of the emigrants today, these 7,000 living tongues, are not simple descendants of a single ancestral language. The relationship is more like a bush than a tree, with multiple early divergences and extensive subsequent contact and borrowing. But they share the deep architecture. The universal grammar that Noam Chomsky famously argued was the product of a specific human language faculty rather than a general learning capacity. Whether Chomsky's specific theoretical claims about the nature of this faculty are correct, the facts he was trying to explain are real. Human languages are all structurally similar in ways that non-human communication systems are not. They are all, in a deep sense, the same kind of thing, and that same kind of thing was present in the people who made the crossing. There is a poignancy to the lost languages. Of the 7,000 languages spoken today, a large fraction are critically endangered, with fewer speakers than will be required to maintain the language across generations. Every 2 weeks, on average, a language dies when its last fluent speaker dies. Each lost language takes with it a unique way of parsing the world. A specific set of vocabulary items encoding ecological and social knowledge accumulated over centuries or millennia, grammatical structures that organize experience differently from any other language, stories and songs and ways of saying the unsayable that exist in that language alone. The rate of language lost today is historically unprecedented, driven by the economic and political dominance of a small number of major world languages, and by the cultural pressures that make fluency in those major languages economically necessary in a globalized world. The languages of the Aboriginal Australians are among the most endangered. Of the roughly 250 distinct languages spoken on the Australian continent at the time of European arrival, perhaps 120 are still spoken by any fluent speakers, and of these, fewer than 20 are being transmitted to children. The languages of the first Australians, the descendants of the people who made that extraordinary sea crossing 50,000 years ago, who maintained continuous cultural traditions for longer than any other group in human history, are being lost at a rate that represents one of the great cultural catastrophes of our time. Each of these languages encodes an accumulated knowledge of the Australian landscape, its plants and animals and seasons and resources that took 50,000 years to develop, and that is irreplaceable in the literal sense that no process of reconstruction or documentation can recover a living language from records and field notes once its last speakers are gone. What survives in the languages of living peoples is a fragment of the linguistic legacy of the dispersal. A fragment, but a real one. A thread, however frayed and transformed, connecting the people in your world tonight, speaking their languages and thinking their thoughts in the specific cognitive frameworks their languages provide to the people who walked out of Africa 68,000 years ago, carrying their words with them into the unknown. The words changed. The structures changed. The sounds changed. But something persisted. Something in the deep architecture. Something in the human need to put the world into language and to share that language with other people that has not changed at all. And that was present fully and completely in the first people who crossed the water. Let me try to make this specific. Let me try to give you one person or one moment within this vast story, because vast stories are best understood through their individual threads. There is a woman, though we do not know her name, and we will not know it, because names are not preserved in stone or in bone or in the chemical signatures of ancient DNA. She is living somewhere in the region of what is now the Horn of Africa, or the southern Arabian coast, 65 to 70,000 years ago. She is perhaps 25 years old, which, in the demographic context of the late Pleistocene, makes her a mature adult. A woman who has probably already had children, who has accumulated a substantial body of practical knowledge about her world, who occupies a recognized position in the social landscape of her group. She is small by modern standards, her body shaped by a childhood and adolescence of continuous physical activity in a warm climate with a diet that was nutritionally variable but rich in protein from the coastal resources she has spent her life exploiting. Her hands are calloused and precise. She knows how to knap flint. She knows which shellfish beds are productive at which tidal states. She knows the social hierarchy of her group down to its finest gradations, and has navigated it successfully enough to have children who are alive. She has seen the water to the east. The Red Sea at this point in its history, narrowed by the lowered sea level, is perhaps 20 to 30 kilometers across at the passage. On clear days, the land on the other side is visible. She has seen it her whole life. She does not know what it is. She has no concept of a different continent, no map, no understanding of the geography that we have. What she has is the practical knowledge that the land on the other side exists, that it is reachable, that others in the group have discussed reaching it, and a specific set of skills and social relationships that make her a valuable member of any crossing party. The crossing itself, when it happens, is probably not experienced as a historic moment. There is no ceremony of departure, no awareness that this is the event that will eventually produce every human being who will ever live outside of Africa. There is a practical problem, getting across the water, and a practical solution. Watercraft of some kind, probably multiple trips with a small group at a time, in favorable sea conditions, using knowledge of the winds and currents that experience in coastal waters had already provided. The crossing is terrifying, in all probability. Open water is a genuinely threatening environment for animals that cannot swim indefinitely. And the people making this crossing are not experienced blue water sailors. They are coastal foragers who have made short crossings before, but nothing of this length. The emotional experience of the crossing, the specific quality of the fear and the effort and the relief when the other shore finally resolves from a distant haze into a real beach is unrecoverable. We can only feel around the edges of it by imagining ourselves in a small, low vessel on open water with no certainty that we are going to reach the other side. But they reach it. The beach on the other side is, at first inspection, not very different from the beach they left. The same kind of coast, the same general ecological community, similar shellfish in the tidal pools, similar birds overhead. The differences emerge over days and weeks of movement eastward, as the group pushes into terrain that is genuinely new, that their accumulated cultural knowledge does not cover in its specifics, that requires them to improvise, to test, to learn from experience in real time what works and what does not. A plant that looks like one they know from home that turns out to be mildly toxic. A prey animal whose behavior differs slightly from the animals they hunted in Africa. A water source discovered by following an animal they did not recognize, which turned out to be reliable. The learning happens at the edge of the known, which is precisely where the most important learning always happens. Her children, if they survive, will grow up in this new world. They will know it as home in a way that she never quite will. And their children will know an even newer stretch of it as home, pushed further east or north by the same combination of population pressure and the impulse to know what is over the next ridge. And so on, generation by generation, the thread of human presence in the new world lengthening by a few kilometers per year. The knowledge of each new generation building on the accumulated experience of the last. The ratchet clicking forward. The horizon receding forever ahead of the people who chase it. Several thousand years later, in what is now the coast of Pakistan or India, a small group of people camps at the mouth of a river. They are the great-great-great-grandchildren, dozens of times removed, of the woman who made the crossing. They do not know this. They do not have a concept of their own history that extends back that far. They know the stories that are told in their group, which go back perhaps 10 or 15 generations in any reliable form, and beyond that dissolve into myth, into the stories about the ancestors that serve cultural purposes, but do not constitute historical memory in any strict sense. They do not know they are part of a dispersal event of planetary significance. They know the river mouth and the fish in it, and the shellfish in the tidal flat, and the game in the forest behind the camp, and the social world of their group, and the names of the stars that have guided their movement along the coast. They are sitting around a fire. It is late. The children are asleep. Two adults are talking in low voices about something, a disagreement within the group, a decision about where to move next, the behavior of an unfamiliar animal seen that afternoon. One of them is making something, working a piece of bone with a stone point, the action habitual and barely conscious, the hands doing their practiced work while the mind is elsewhere. The fire is low. The stars over the Indian Ocean are brilliant in the way they are only possible away from any source of artificial light. The sound of the sea is constant and close. This is not a dramatic moment. It is an ordinary night in an ordinary camp in a life that is full of difficulty and full of meaning and full of the specific textures of experience that constitute being alive. The significance of what this group represents, this particular link in the longest chain in human history, exists only from a perspective that neither they nor anyone they know has or could have. The significance is retrospective, imposed by us, looking back. To them, they are just people, camping by a river, talking in the dark, not very different from the people they were last year or the people their parents were. And that is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to as we think about the out of Africa dispersal. The journey was not experienced as a journey. It was experienced as life, as the accumulation of ordinary days in which decisions were made and problems were solved and children were raised and food was found and stories were told. The extraordinary thing that was happening, the thing that would eventually produce all of human civilization, was happening in the texture of the ordinary. That is how the most consequential things always happen. Not in moments of heroic awareness, but in the daily accumulation of small decisions made by people who were simply doing their best to live. The science of human dispersal is still being written. Every few years, a new ancient DNA study, a new archaeological discovery, a new application of isotopic analysis or satellite imagery to the detection of old landscapes adds a layer of complexity or resolves a long-standing controversy, or creates a new one. The field is genuinely alive, genuinely in motion, and the picture it is producing is far richer and more complicated than the simple arrows on a map version that many people carry in their heads. What has become clear, with increasing confidence over the past 2 decades of genetic and archaeological research, is that the story was messier than any single neat narrative can capture. There were almost certainly multiple dispersal events, not just one crossing of the Bab el-Mandeb. There is genetic evidence, read from the variation in living populations in South Asia and Australasia, for at least 2 distinct waves of migration. One that contributed most of the ancestry of indigenous Australians and Papuans and certain other populations of Southern Asia, and a later wave that contributed most of the ancestry of populations in Northern Eurasia, East Asia, and the Americas. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. There may have been earlier dispersals of modern humans into the Levant that did not persist, leaving no genetic legacy in living populations. The boundaries between populations, the lines on the map that show who was where when, were never fixed, never impermeable, always subject to revision by the movements of people in both directions. There were backflows, populations that had moved far from Africa and had diverged substantially in their genetic profiles, moved back into Africa, carrying genes that were ultimately of African origin, but had been processed through tens of thousands of years of evolutionary divergence in Eurasia. The genetic history of Africa itself, far from being simply the stable source population from which everyone else derived, is full of complexity, of ancient admixture events, of population movements and replacements that predate the out-of-Africa dispersal. The deepest splits in the human family tree, the genetic lineages that separated earliest, are found within Africa, in populations like the San of Southern Africa and the Hadza and Sandawe of East Africa, who carry the deepest roots of human genetic diversity and whose ancestors represent some of the oldest lineages in our family tree. The tools for reading all of this have improved at a pace that has been genuinely astonishing, even to the scientists who use them. In 2010, when the first complete Neanderthal genome was published, the ability to extract and sequence ancient DNA from fossil bones was still novel and technically demanding. By the early 2020s, the field had advanced to the point where detailed genomic data was being produced from hundreds of ancient individuals across the globe, including specimens many tens of thousands of years old from permafrost sites in Siberia and Central Asia. Each new genome adds a data point to the map of human prehistory, and the map has become, over the past decade, startlingly detailed. We can now track specific populations across time and space, watching them expand and contract and mix and separate, with a resolution that would have seemed impossibly ambitious to researchers working just a generation ago. What does all of this tell us about ourselves? About the human species as it is today, sitting in rooms and cars and aircraft, living in a world so transformed from the one our ancestors walked through, that the specific skills that carried them across the planet are largely vestigial, no longer selected for, no longer the determinant of reproductive success in the way they once were? One thing it tells us is that we are one species. Deeply, inescapably, biologically one species. The genetic diversity between any 2 human populations on Earth is smaller than the genetic diversity within those populations. This is the legacy of the founder effects, the repeated bottlenecks of the dispersal that compressed genetic diversity and kept the differences between separated populations from growing as large as the differences we see between populations of many other species. Any 2 humans, chosen at random from anywhere on Earth, are vastly more genetically similar to each other than any 2 chimpanzees, chosen from within a single chimpanzee population in Central Africa. The visual differences between human populations, the differences in skin color and hair texture and facial structure that have been so freighted with social and political meaning throughout human history, are a thin and recent veneer over an underlying genetic unity that is the direct legacy of our species' common origin and recent dispersal. We look different. We are, by every biological measure that matters, the same. Another thing the science tells us is that the differences between populations that do exist are largely adaptive. Skin pigmentation varies with latitude because the ultraviolet flux varies with latitude. And melanin pigmentation is a trade-off between protection from ultraviolet damage, which is most important at low latitudes, and vitamin D synthesis, which requires ultraviolet exposure and is most critical at high latitudes. The lighter skin of populations from high-latitude northern Eurasia is an adaptation to the reduced ultraviolet flux of those latitudes, allowing enough UV to penetrate the skin for adequate vitamin D synthesis in environments where sunlight is both reduced and seasonal. It is not a mark of anything other than the latitude at which a lineage has been living for the past tens of thousands of years. The Neanderthal genetic variants that contribute to immune function in modern Eurasian populations are another example of local adaptation, the incorporation of evolutionary solutions developed by a population that had been adapting to Eurasian pathogens and climates for hundreds of thousands of years. We carry their adaptations in us, as we carry adaptations from every environment our ancestors inhabited. The story of our dispersal is not the story of superior and inferior peoples. It is the story of a single species, carrying a set of remarkable cognitive and social capabilities, spreading into a world whose enormous variety of environments called forth an enormous variety of local adaptations, producing the surface-level diversity of appearance and culture that we see today, while leaving the deep biological unity of our species essentially intact. The people at Blombos Cave and the people who painted Chauvet and the people who first set foot in Australia and the people who crossed the ice of Beringia into the Americas were all the same people in every biological sense that matters. They were all us, and we are all them. The last thing, and perhaps the most quietly astonishing, is the timeline. 68,000 years. That is approximately 2,700 generations. If you lay out those generations in a line, each one stepping back one human lifetime from the previous, the line ends not in unimaginable antiquity, but at a specific, datable, perhaps even nameable moment in the late Pleistocene. 2,700 grandmothers, stacked in a line. The grandmother at the far end of that line crossed the Bab el Mandeb. The grandmother at the near end of the line might be someone you actually knew. The distance between them is enormous in years. It is much smaller in human terms, in the terms of the chain of care and memory and transmission that connects one generation to the next. 2,700 times a mother watched her child take their first steps. 2,700 times a family moved camp, and a child looked back at the place they were leaving and wondered if they would see it again. 2,700 times the knowledge and the stories and the social patterns of one generation passed into the minds and bodies of the next. And here we are at the near end of the line, carrying all of it forward in our cells and our languages and our ways of sitting around a fire, which we still do anywhere and everywhere on this earth, because that is what our ancestors did when they were alive, and it worked, and so we kept doing it. Tonight, wherever you are, the journey has not ended. It has only paused. You are lying in a room that is the result of 10,000 years of architectural tradition, sleeping in a way that the ancestors described tonight could not have imagined, surrounded by objects produced by a global civilization that would be incomprehensible to any of the people we have followed this evening. And yet, you are, in every biological sense, one of them. The same hands, the same nervous system, the same ancient mammalian brain running its nightly maintenance cycle, sorting the experiences of the day, filing away what is needed and releasing what is not, doing the work that makes tomorrow's learning possible. The people who crossed the Bab el-Mandeb slept in the open, or in whatever shelter they could make. Their nights were darker than any night you have experienced. The predators of the late Pleistocene were real and numerous, and the group sleeping together at the edge of the fire was the only protection available. There was no distinction in those camps between the people who needed protecting and the people doing the protecting. Everyone watched. Everyone listened. The sleep was lighter, more easily broken, more responsive to the sounds of the night than yours is likely to be in your room tonight. But the need was the same. The body's demand for rest, for the nightly restoration that is as fundamental to human biology as eating or breathing, was the same then as it is now. Sleep is the most ancient human activity that you will engage in tonight. Older than cooking, older than language, or at least as old. The architecture of sleep, the cycle of light and deep sleep and dream and waking, is shared by every human being alive, and was shared by every human being who has ever lived, including the woman who stood at the edge of the Horn of Africa and looked at the water. Whatever she dreamed in the camps she made on the eastern shore of the Red Sea. Her dreaming brain followed the same basic cycle that yours will follow tonight. The continuity is real. It is not metaphorical. The biology that produces dreaming in you is the same biology, more or less unchanged, that produced dreaming in her. The stars that will be above your location tonight, if the sky is clear, are mostly the same stars that were above the crossing point 68,000 years ago. Not exactly the same configuration, because the stars have proper motions, and the Earth wobbles in ways that shift the apparent positions of things over very long time scales, but mostly the same. Orion is roughly where it has always been. The Southern Cross, visible from the latitudes at which the crossing probably occurred, was there then. The Milky Way was there. The vast smear of the galaxy's disk, visible on dark, moonless nights as a band of light that those first emigrants saw without knowing what it was, without the concept of a galaxy or the knowledge that they were embedded in one, but saw nonetheless. The sky is the most persistent feature of the world we share with them. The distance between you and the people we have been following tonight is real. It is 68,000 years. It is measured in languages that have diverged beyond any possibility of mutual comprehension. In technological transitions so profound that a member of the founding group, transported to your room, would not recognize a single object in it. It is measured in the accumulated cultural change that is what those 68,000 years have been, mostly. The biology changed very little. The culture changed out of all recognition. And yet here you both are, at either end of the chain. You at the near end, lying in your room, your body doing its ancient work of rest. They at the far end, doing the same, under different stars in a different landscape with different dangers and different joys and a different name for everything they saw. Connected by an unbroken sequence of lives, each one sleeping, each one waking, each one passing something forward, until the forward end of the chain reached this room, tonight, where you are lying in the dark and the thoughts are slowing and the questions that felt urgent are releasing their grip, and the body is beginning to do what the body has been doing for 300,000 years. What it was doing before our species had a name. What it will keep doing long after any name we give it has been forgotten. You are safe in the way that matters most. The fire is close. The camp is settled. The darkness outside is the same darkness that was always outside. The same night that surrounded every camp that every ancestor of yours ever made. All the way back to the crossing, and before it, to the warm forests of Eastern Africa, where something was becoming us, and did not know it yet. Sleep now. The journey will continue in the morning, as it always has, as it always does, forward into a world that is not yet known, but that will be, one day, one small piece at a time, by the people who keep walking toward it with their eyes open and their hands ready, and their curiosity, that most ancient and most human quality, still alive and still asking what is over the next ridge, what is on the other side of the water, what is waiting in the dark at the far edge of the firelight. Sleep now. You have been walking for a very long time. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.